Cheese predates written history. Ancient Egyptians loved cheese so much that depictions of the cheese-making process were painted in tombs. Homer's Odyssey talks about how Cyclops stored his cheese. The Greeks and Romans used cheese as a delicious currency. During the Middle Ages, if there was cheese on the dinner table, it meant the family was of at least moderate wealth. While cheese has been around for ages, many cheeses we eat today were invented over the last 500 years. A few were even invented in the United States, Monterey Jack cheese being one of them. So how did Monterey Jack get its unique name? Now, before we get into all of that, we must go back about 300 years to the Spanish monasteries of California. Back in the 18th century, Spanish missionaries began their takeover of California. It was on July the 16th, 1769, when the first Catholic mission was founded at present-day San Diego. Over a 60-year period, starting in 1769, 21 outposts were settled by Catholic priests of the Franciscan order to spread their beliefs among the local population. The second one, established after San Diego, was in today's Monterey, California. The Spanish missionaries very much desired to be self-sufficient, although they didn't quite achieve this, with some financial support coming from the Pious Fund of Californias, established in 1697 by Spain. Later, this would become the subject of litigation between the US and Mexico. They did bring supplies, foodstuffs, seeds, and livestock into California that were never before seen in the Americas. For example, grapes, apples, and figs were grown for the first time in this part of the world at this time. These fruits had originated in Asia, but had come over to Europe before this as a product of trade. Oranges, also originally from Asia, actually were planted for the first time in North America in the Gulf Coast and Caribbean regions about 150 years prior. Approximately in the early 17th century, but made their first appearance on North America's west coast due to Spanish missionaries. Livestock like cattle were also part of the European colonization of America. Arriving in the mid-17th century from Europe, cattle were a huge food and supply, like leather source, for the settlers. Of course, there was also milk from these cows. Any fresh milk that wasn't used was preserved and converted into cheese. In Monterey, the cheese they made was soft, creamy, and light, and it became a part of the Spanish missionaries' regular diet. They called it queso blanco país, or the country peasant white cheese. Hence the Monterey part of the name Monterey Jack, with the town itself named after the Viceroy of New Spain, the 5th Count of Monterey. The latter, Monterey, ultimately derives from the Galician Monterrey, essentially meaning mountain king. Alright, so what about Jack? Well, let's fast forward about 70 years to 1841, when a Scottish immigrant by the name of David Jack arrived in New York. He became a storekeeper with his two brothers who had already been in America. It's not clear exactly what their store sold, but at some point they became army contractors and hosted military personnel, including one Robert E. Lee. Apparently unsatisfied with store life and having heard about the great fortunes to be made in the California gold rush, in 1848 Jack made his way west. Before he left, though, he bought $1,400, which is about $37,000 today, worth of revolvers in the hope of selling them out west to law-abiding and lawless alike. He did exactly that and made a heady profit. His gold speculating wasn't as profitable, though, and like so many others, he moved to San Francisco to try and make ends meet. He became a customs agent and found his way to Monterey on a business trip. Jack fell in love with the Central Coast town and officially moved there, but he struggled. In fact, he went back to Scotland for a year when his father passed away. But he returned, and he was determined to become a rich member of the community. In 1821, Mexico gained their independence from Spain after an 11-year war to earn that right. In order to encourage expansion, the Mexican government continued what the Spaniards had started by issuing land grants or ranchos to individuals. These individuals were allowed to settle, farm, and use the land however they saw fit. In 1846, only 25 years after Mexico's independence, the U.S. Army invaded the Mexican territories of New Mexico and California, and the Mexican-American War began. This wasn't the first time the United States had forcibly tried to take land from Mexico. In 1845, America had annexed Texas. Within 22 months, the U.S. had won the war, and their territorial expansion to the Pacific coast was complete. The Treaty of Guadalupe Guadalupe Hidalgo allowed at least somewhat of a conciliatory end to the war. The treaty called for several major concessions on both sides. Mexico was to cede California, New Mexico, and the rest of Arizona to the U.S., plus it recognized the U.S.'s claim to Texas. In return, the U.S. would pay Mexico $15 million, which is about $400 million today, as well as offer citizenship to any Mexican living in those lands, and still uphold the rancho system set out by the Mexican government. While these promises in theory were kept, the United States government found a way around that last provision. U.S. government-run commissions were set up to determine who actually owned the ranchos. The rancho owners were forced to provide documentation, deeds, and records in order to prove that this was their land. Many of them could not do this due to the years that had passed since they gained ownership of the land and the lack of need for documentation in Mexico at the time. Alright, so this is the point where we go back to Mr. David Jack. In 1853, with the US still sorting out all of those land grants, the Pueblo of Monterey attempted to make its claim that the land belonged to the town, not the US government. They hired Delos Rodin Ashley as their lawyer. He would later go on to be California's treasurer and a Nevada congressman. He actually won their claim for them, but demanded nearly $1,000 in fees. The town was broke and it was forced to auction off its lands anyway to pay Ashley. On February 9, 1859 at 5 p.m., the auction commenced. The sole bidders were Ashley and David Jack. They purchased every single inch of land in Monterey that day, nearly 30,000 acres, for $1,002.50. Thus, Ashley got his money from the city and then some when he later turned over his rights to the land to Jack. It wasn't hard to believe that this was some sort of setup. A suit concerning the auction and subsequent purchase went all the way to the Supreme Court and became known as the Rape of Monterey. David Jack quietly profited on his land through farming, grazing, and charging obscene taxes on those who had built on it. He was a ruthless man. Jack acquired even more land and immediately began foreclosing on properties. He did this by posting foreclosure notices on hard-to-find parts of individual properties and in a different language. As in, if it was a Mexican owner, the notices were in English. If they were English-speaking Americans, then those notices were in Spanish. These lands hosted many types of businesses that Jack now owned, including 14 different dairies that were operated by Spanish and Portuguese dairymen within the Monterey lands. Whenever they had excess milk, they preserved it by turning it into cheese, the special Queso Blanco País, or the country peasant white cheese. Well, since Jack co-owned these dairies, he claims that the cheese was his. He slapped his name on it, and he called it Jack's Cheese. Soon the cheese began selling all across California and the West Coast. In order to identify where it came from, people began calling it Monterey Jack Cheese. As you might be able to imagine, David Jack was totally fine with this. To this day, it is still called Monterey Jack, and derivatives such as Colby Jack, which is a mixture of Colby and Monterey Jack cheese, also exist, which kind of are a homage to a ruthless, corrupt Californian landowner who claimed an old cheese recipe as his own. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. If you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out my channel called Top 10s? It's videos like this, same sort of fun, interesting facts and bits like that from history, but in a top 10 format. Find it linked to on the screen now as well as below this video. And as always, thank you for watching.